In this video, I'll cover the assembly of my FLSUN T1 Pro 3D printer. There are some other videos out there covering the minute details about how this is assembled. I'll try to focus on the highlights and the things that I learned along the way that might help you out. I'm speeding through the unboxing. You can see this in other videos. If you want to see what was actually in the box, you can pause. I recommend that you follow the manual as you're assembling it. It is put together pretty well. There's a few things here and there that I'll try to explain in more detail, but for the most part, following the manual is the best way to go. There is one change I would recommend though. The very last thing you see in the assembly process is switching, if necessary, from 230 to 115 volts. Now you should know, based on where you live, whether or not you use 115 volts. By default, this is set to 230 out of the factory. So if you live in a country that uses 230 volt electricity, you're already set. But if you live in the US and I think Japan, for example, and other countries that use 115 volt power, you'll need to switch this from 230 volts to 115 volts. So I think it'll be easier if you make this update early on in the process, before you start assembly. The next step is you take the top, put on these brackets, and this is what holds the filament spool in place. It's pretty straightforward. There are some notches that the part will fit into, so it makes it easy to see how they fit. I'll talk about this more later, but this bar across here is not the best in that some spools, especially cardboard spools, may have a lot of friction as it's unwinding. So one of the first things I printed was a hub that allows for it to spin more freely. The next thing you'll do is take the three sides and put them into place. You see the three goes here where this cable is, so after unwinding the cable, put it into the slot on the left side of the front where the monitor will go. The next part you'll put in is the one with the LED light. You'll want to be careful here and at other points in the assembly not to get wires caught between two parts that you're putting together. I'll try to point those out throughout the video. And then the last piece is in the back. This one's pretty easy. One thing I didn't show previously is that this wire goes through this side piece. So you'll need to pull that out and keep it out of the way when you're assembling it. I took off the stickers from these side pieces and put them on the outside just to make sure I removed them first of all, but then I also wanted to keep them labeled in case I needed to refer back to it in the future. I didn't really need to, but I thought better safe than sorry. Then next thing you do is take the top. You'll attach these wires, which I'll show you later on. And then there's this hose and cable that comes down from the top. I temporarily removed the spool holder just to make sure it didn't fall out during assembly. So you take the FLSUN logo and you put it on the front. On the left there is the number 3 part. So that goes to the left of the FLSUN logo. Make sure that these wires are out of the way so that they don't get pinched. And then you'll have these gaps. After you put the top on, you'll want to push them down and you can hear a click. That means they're secure. Reconfirm that the cables at the top of the three sides are not being pinched between the pieces. We'll come back to connect these wires later on. The next thing you'll do is screw the top and bottom into place. Note that they fit into here where it's threaded on the inside, so if you keep that in mind, you'll be able to align them better as you're screwing them into place. I had better luck getting them into place pushing down on the top to get it better aligned. If I didn't push down, then the screw didn't quite line up with the thread. Do that on top and on bottom on all three sides. There are 4 screws at each of the 3 sides on top and bottom, so a total of 24 screws. You'll have a couple of leftover bolts. In the end, I actually had quite a few leftover parts, which made me a little nervous, but I think it was okay. At this point, the structure is relatively rigid. This next part was the most confusing for me in the assembly. What you want to do is take 2 types of screws and put them into these holes that you see. There are these tiny screws here. You'll need 6 of those. And these slightly larger ones, 6 of those as well. And you will have some leftover parts here also. I couldn't find any place that I needed them later on, so I suppose they're extra parts. So you put them into these 12 holes that I'm showing you here. Now the way that you install them was a little bit unclear to me, so I looked at another video that shows assembly. So you can probably see here how they're installed. The 2 smaller ones on the outside and the larger ones on the inside. Also keep in mind that you don't want to over tighten beyond the point where they start to get snug. This blue material keeps the screws from going fully into the holes without using a little bit more torque. The reason for this is that the next step of assembly requires these holes to be open and allow for some pins to get in. So you don't want to over tighten these screws at this point, or you'll just have to loosen them again in order to get the pins in. That will make more sense in a minute. The larger screws were relatively easy to get into place. The smaller ones were a bit more of a challenge. At one point, I dropped one of these inside of this assembly, and I was going to show it rattling around, but it actually fell out onto this magnetic dish. So it fell into that hole. It's pretty easy to get out, as you saw, but you'll want to be careful at this point that you don't drop this part into the assembly. So once you're done, you'll have all 12 screws in, again, not over tightened. This is where the filament is supposed to be fed through. I've actually found that I have better luck, or I have good luck, leaving the filament not going through this. So the next part is what I mentioned earlier. These pins need to fit into the holes underneath the screws that we just installed. The trick here is just getting the pins lined up with the hole. It's not difficult. You'll have to pull against the spring a little bit to get it installed, but again, keeping the pin pointed in the direction that you want it to go is going to be the key here. And don't forget the sticker. After that, you can tighten down those bolts that we previously installed now that the pins are in place. This next part was a little bit confusing for me. The instructions said to install the hose first and then this cable. I probably could have gotten it in, but I had a little bit of a struggle fitting the cable in. So I decided to take off the hose and install the cable first. And then after that, I put the hose back on. This rubber is very soft, so you'll have to do it delicately. You don't want to rip the rubber here. Take your time and just get it on slowly. After that, you'll need to install these screws. First, I had a hard time getting the screw into there. I was trying to hold the head suspended in air. I didn't want to push down it too much. But I struggled to get the screw in, so I finally decided to just push it all the way to the bottom and let it rest on the bed. And then I had no problem after that. In the process though, here and at least one other place I think in the assembly, I managed to strip out the head on the screw. As you've seen, I'm using my own tool. I generally prefer to use this, but you see the head is a little bit rounded, which makes it easier to use in some ways, but it may have made it also easier to strip out the screw. It made it in okay. Fortunately, this is not a critical point in the assembly. It's just holding the cable in place, but I probably will have a bit of difficulty if I ever need to remove this cable. After that, you install the camera. This is relatively easy. Just make sure you get that cable out of the way. Click it into place. Fits pretty securely. You have these cables here. There's two that attach that we made sure not to pinch earlier in the assembly. And then the USB-C connector goes into the bottom, and that comes directly from the camera. Now is the time that you connect the cables at the top that we left before. There's a couple of connectors at the top of each of the walls. This white one was inside the assembly. I had to pull it out and it goes into this PCB. And then it's just rinse and repeat for the others. At this point, you'll want to remove this plate on the side, the left side of the front. And it's here that you bring this cable from the bottom up to the top. It clicks into place into these two connectors. And then you reinstall the plate. Originally there are 3 screws in the plate, just temporarily holding it in place. You put those 3 back, and then you put in 3 more screws for a total of 6. And then you have these exposed wires here. They seem pretty secure, but we have this number 2 part that goes over the top of that. It just clicks into place. It looks like it might screw into place, but I believe it only needs to be clicked into place. And it is intended to be installed like that. Next, remove this tape very carefully. Make sure that you don't damage this cable as you're pulling the tape away from it. This is what connects to the monitor. The monitor fits into these slots right here. And then the cable will need to fit. As you see here, the blue part, at least on my printer, is facing up. The key to connecting this to the monitor is you'll need to flip up this little flap here, and that unlocks the connector. And then you can slide the cable into the connector. This is relatively delicate, so just take your time and be careful. Once you've done that, push it back down and that should lock the cable in place. Give it a little tug to make sure it's fully inserted. After that, make sure again that the cable is not twisted, and you'll slot the monitor in place like this. The next step is putting in these crossbars. They're pretty simple. Use these M3x6 screws. There are 4 screws for each part. They just go into the sides, as you see here. And these will go on the back side of the printer, the left and right. Once you've installed the crossbars, move the head up and down just to make sure that it's not making any contact with these. I don't believe you have an issue, but it's probably better to check just to make sure it can freely go up and down. Next, you will install these plexiglass panels on the left and right, not the front. Peel off one side of the protective plastic. Turn it around to the inside, and then put it in place. There are some clips at the top and bottom that will hold it securely. And then you'll use these screws to fasten to these crossbars. Again, do that on both sides. The next step, you move on to the front door. The instructions mention spacers. My package was labeled gasket, so I think you can use those interchangeably. The instructions also say to install the door handle first. I didn't do that. Created a slight issue for me. I'll explain in a minute. But the key here is that you want to be more careful here because this is glass, it's not plexiglass. The gaskets or spacers will protect the glass from the screws, so you want to make sure that they are between the screw and the glass. I put all of the gaskets onto the screws ahead of time because if you have one screw in place and then you're trying to mess around with that, then you could potentially shatter the glass. So I wanted to be prepared to put all of the screws in as quickly as possible. The small issue I mentioned is that the door closes pretty securely and I couldn't easily open it back up. So I just decided to use the Allen wrench like this and gently pull it open. After that, install the handle, which I should have done before installing the door. This is pretty straightforward. Don't forget the gaskets on this one as well. And after that, the assembly is pretty much done. As I mentioned before, the instruction manual tells you at this point to switch from 230 volt to 115 volt if necessary in your area. So you should have already done this in the first step if you followed that part of the video. I think I mentioned I did have some leftover parts. Made me a little bit nervous, but I think these are just extras in case we need them later on. If you noticed anything that I did miss, please let me know in the comments. Now you're ready to plug it in and try it out. Make sure that the power switch is set in the off position. The printer does come with some white filament and it was sealed. I thought it would be okay, but it was pretty much useless. I don't know if some moisture got into the package somehow, but it was still sealed when I opened it. Fortunately, I had also purchased some PLA filament from Micro Center where I bought this printer. So I installed that. Set up the printer and did some test prints. Of course, the first print had to be a benchy. I decided to go with a 22-minute benchy instead of the fast one. Just wanted my first print to be reasonably good quality. I'm not a benchy expert, but I think this one turned out pretty nice. The next thing I printed was this spool holder I mentioned earlier. I downloaded it from Printables. This works nicely to keep my cardboard filament spool turning freely. Before I put in the spool holder, there was a lot of friction. It looked like the filament was getting pulled pretty tightly because the spool wasn't freely turning. After putting in this spool holder, I've had no issues whatsoever with the spool. I hope this video has helped you in some way. Please comment below if you have any follow-up questions. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in another video.